Museum Digit
2020.
A Magyar Nemzeti Múzeum online
virtuális konferenciája.
Thanks for inviting me to the Museum Digit 2020 conference, now online in Budapest. And a particular thank you to be able to speak in the section on museums and social impact. I'm particularly happy to address you with the focus on inclusive museums, because inclusion is very close to my heart when we think about the future of museums. I think that the way in which museums work with inclusiveness is absolutely key to their future viability. So let me start right away by offering you my two key claims, which I hope to underpin by what I have to say to you today. First of all, I think it's important that museums must move towards a radical definition of inclusion, which fosters affinities of relevance to divergent sections of society. And secondly, my second claim is that one way forward for museums to foster such radical inclusion is to design for cultural citizenship. But first of all, of course, it's important to be aware that inclusion can mean many things for many museums. It can be defined in terms of substance, that is, inclusion is the focal theme of the museum collection. And on the screen, you can see one example from Lima, Peru, where inclusion is the focal theme for the museum. But of course, inclusion can also be defined in terms of widening access. And this widening access can be to the physical museum, for underserved groups, or for people with disabilities. It can also be widening access to the museum online through assistive technologies. So there are many definitions at play in very many different museums. But despite its many definitions, the concept of inclusion is often applied with museums in such a way that the museum offers more of the same to more people. And this is what I'll call incremental inclusion. I propose that we apply the concept of inclusion in a more radical fashion, because inclusion can also be seen as a particular means of communication where audiences become included through their communication with the museum and with one another. And this approach to inclusion is what I'll call radical inclusion. Why is radical inclusion important? First, because it helps change the state of play in how museums understand their role in society. Museums that adopt a radical approach to inclusion will begin to define themselves in terms of how they communicate, how they interact with the outside world, and not in terms of the collections or materials they hold. Second, radical inclusion is important because it makes museum audiences better equipped to acknowledge diversity and difference. And diversity and difference are preconditions for living well in complex democratic societies. Incremental inclusion, on the other hand, does not necessarily change the ways museums communicate with its audiences. Adopting incremental inclusion, museums can stay the same when they include underserved groups or the visually impaired, for example. And audiences can feel just as excluded after visiting the museum on site or online if they're dressed as others, or if they're labeled symbolically or physically as minorities or underserved. So how can museums advance their inclusive means of communication? One way forward, I claim, is to design for cultural citizenship. And I'll provide an example of how such designs can be shaped. And furthermore, I'll indicate why they help audiences acknowledge diversity and difference. And the example I'll provide is to give you some insights into the Our Museum program. Our Museum, where I serve as National Director, is a national research and development program which focuses precisely on how museums can catalyze cultural citizenship. We started in 2016 and we finish next year. And we're a committed partnership that encompasses all major Danish universities and 8 museum partners. We have 13 different projects embracing junior and senior researchers and museum professionals in long-term collaboration. And altogether, we have a €6 million budget funded primarily by 2 private foundations and also the participating partners. So to give you a bit of background on the work that we do at our museum program, let me just give you a bit of indication of how we approach cultural citizenship. So what is cultural citizenship? Well, first of all, we understand culture as a way to understand oneself and the world. It's not just culture being hosted by particular cultural institutions. It's also very much a kind of approach to the world. It's a dimension of the world where we live and we learn to understand who we are, how others act and react on an everyday basis. And cultural citizenship we understand as a key lever of active participation in democratic societies. Because to be a citizen is not merely a rational act when voting, and citizenship is also more than just participating in rational policy official debates. So cultural citizenship basically is about cultural practices on an everyday basis that can catalyze how we understand ourselves and others as part of society. And in democratic societies, importantly, a recognition of diversity and difference is key to participation. Cultural institutions such as museums can offer key settings where people can meet, interact, and confront themselves with how others live and see the world, how relations have been in the past and could be in the future. And this is why cultural citizenship is key to radical inclusion in museums. So how does our museum program explore cultural citizenship? It's important to give you an indication of our research designs. We study how museums facilitate cultural citizenship both currently and in the past. And in this presentation, I'll focus on the current dimensions where we explore and innovate at our partner museums how cultural citizenship can be formed. That is, we have a transformative aim. We do more than study what already exists, how our partner museums already work with cultural citizenship processes. So we want to innovate and explore how museums can work in different ways. And in that sense, designing for cultural citizenship is also very importantly to design for social dialogue. And we do so by, first of all, co-designing with our partner museums issues about social dialogue that seem important to the museum. Then we see how these experiments are implemented, and we evaluate, importantly, with our partner museums to give feedback on how they could improve these processes of innovation. So this is a kind of holistic research cycle that provides important input to the museum in how they can constantly innovate their work in terms of radical inclusion. And importantly, we design for social dialogue in such a way that it's more than having visitors' personal voices being heard. Because if you focus just on voice, individual voice, you risk that nobody listens and everybody stays in their familiar bubbles of understanding. We also go beyond thinking about inclusion and social dialogue as being more than participating in a special event or inclusion in particular exhibitions hosted by the museum. So to give you a concrete example of how we work, with social dialogue and with this radical inclusion, I'll give you an example from one of our partner museums, the Enigma Museum in Copenhagen. Here, we co-designed a game called Random Access Memory, a game that did two things. It triggered players' memories about their first experiences with the internet, and it facilitated players sharing and discussing these memories across differences of age, gender, and class. Importantly, the museum facilitated the selection of players so that participants were not all the same. And also, very importantly, the very gameplay acted as a scaffold of interaction. So as you can see on the screen, we would have cards that noted particular questions, which would invite discussions and trigger discussions and dialogues on particular issues related to the participants' internet experiences. In the playing sessions, players would offer valuable insights, which we then used to modify the game. And in that sense, players act as co-designers and co-developers of inclusion. The random access memory game is just one concrete example of our general approach at the Our Museum program. In general, our focus is on designs that facilitate social dialogue about particular issues. Some dialogues are on site and some online. Some are in person to person, some are mediated by digital technologies, some have the collections in focus, and some use collections as means of further dialogues. Importantly, issues can be contentious and participants may disagree because dialogue does not necessarily result in consensus. And this is because we subscribe to a familiar notion of democracy, which is that it fosters practices where people can agree to disagree. So consensus is not a necessary result of these dialogues. We also have already seen at the Our Museum programs that museums hold a unique position to offer neutral meeting grounds where differences may play out. They're real training grounds of cultural citizenship. And in that sense, museums are key catalysts of what in this presentation I've called radical inclusion. And this is because museums generally enjoy citizens' trust, also citizens who may differ in their political views, in their social and ethnic and gender backgrounds. It's also because many museums have holdings and materials that can be tweaked into themes of relevance for many people and people of very diverse backgrounds. And last but not least, it's because most people define a museum visit as a social experience. So they're also in many cases open to social interaction. And if museums include actual and potential visitors as co-developers in museums' efforts of inclusion, our results at the Our Museum programs that this leads to better results. So let me sum up some key pointers based on the general results at the Our Museum program. When you design for cultural citizenship, it's very important to put people first and not your collections or technology, and particularly not the latest technology. Also importantly is to focus on social interaction and not individual voice. Go beyond having individual people just voicing their personal opinions. But very importantly, do more than just have people have their say, but moderate communication. Use the museum professional ramifications to give scaffolds to how interaction and communication play out. And importantly, this is because our results demonstrate that if people are just led to their own devices, often social dialogue won't be the result. So it's important that if you want to foster cultural citizenship at the museum, you need to balance institutional authority and audience engagement. But if you do so, it's our very clear documentation that then the museums are really key institutions where radical inclusion can be fostered and can be strengthened. And with that, I'd like to thank all our museum partners, all our museums, partner museums, our universities, and last but not least, our two private foundations who, through their generous grants, have made all of this possible. Thank you.